A woman alone in a storm, then a knock she can't explain. When Ellie opens the lighthouse door, a drenched kitten stares back, but its eyes are wrong. Too wild, too knowing. She whispers, "You're not from here, are you?" Hours later, the forest answers, and something out there wants her to prove it. The wind came first, an old organ moaning through glass. Then the sound of something small, trying not to be heard. Ellie Cross opened the lighthouse door and let a stripe of fog-stained light fall across the stone steps. Salt stung her lips. Rain stitched the night. There, hunched beside the rusted boot scraper, a kitten-shaped shadow flinched at the hinge's sigh. It looked like a house cat until it looked back. The ears were wrong, tapered to sharp tips, and the eyes held the ocean's wild color, blue-gray, unblinking. Wet fur clung to a ribby frame, one forepaw lifted and trembled, not in theatrics, but from cold. Ellie stood at the threshold, the sea hurling itself against basalt below. Inside, the lantern ticked softly as it cooled. From her coat pocket, a dead radio offered the same old hush, a faithful ghost of static. She had learned to live with that hush. Tonight, it answered with another, the small animal's thin breath, quick, held, listening. When the wild calls, she thought, it doesn't come through the radio, it comes to your door. She moved slow. A kettle sighed on the iron stove. She warmed a shallow bowl with milk and a little fish broth, heat without scent, loud enough to carry. On the step, she set the dish and stepped back into the doorway, palms open, voice closed. The creature didn't bolt. It watched. The sea boomed. The lantern ticked. Wind searched the stairwell for secrets and found only salt and wet wool. A tiny nose dipped. The first laps were jittery, then steadier. Hunger, measuring trust in sips. Ellie let breath leave her ribs and did not reach, did not speak, did not promise anything she couldn't keep. The porch light cut the scene in a pale halo. Bowl, stone, small spine, water beading on whiskers like rain on fishing line. When the dish was empty, the animal curled beneath the step, where the wind missed by inches. Ellie slipped an old sailcloth toward the gap, then paused at the sight that made her throat tighten. Faint crescent prints on the wet path, larger than these small paws, arcing in from the cedars and out along the cliff. Not abandoned, she thought. Delivered. She kept the door ajar and the light low. Outside, as the ocean kept time. Inside, the radio gave only static. Between them, on a threshold of stone and salt, a story began. The lighthouse breathed like an animal, iron and glass expanding, contracting, as day pried at the fog. Ellie Cross woke to that old rhythm the way some wake to birds. Gulls combed the air with their blades of sound. The Pacific pushed and retreated, polishing the black basalt below to a monk's patience. The light itself, frosted lens the size of a man's chest, sat quiet at dawn, mantle cooled, prisms filmed with salt dust she'd swiped clean by habit. The building had a memory. It kept time the way the sea keeps time, by returning. She moved through the rooms on calloused feet, the wool of her sweater smelling faintly of smoke and rain. On the weather-peeling table lay the objects that made her days. Tide charts pinned under a compass, a grease pencil, a logbook ruled with narrow lines, and a digital recorder patched with tape. On the hook by the door, her oilskin hung beside a faded orange life ring. In the coat pocket, the little radio she carried everywhere, scuffed, stubborn, offered its familiar hush as she turned the dial. She listened to the hush as if it were a language still learning its verbs. The world beyond the glass portholes was an atlas of grey. Cedar and spruce formed a dark ribcage along the bluff. Kelp swales bowed and rose with the swell. The air smelled of iodine and wood smoke, fish scales, and damp rope. Ellie cracked the window an inch and felt the day find her cheek. She had lived here 3 years, officially as the part-time caretaker, unofficially as what the coast makes of people who stay, a listener. Before that, there had been conference rooms and hydrophones, ship rails cold under palms at 3 a.m., whale song unspooling in headphones like someone else's childhood. Before that, someone's laughter down a crackling handheld. "Mum, you copy?" The wildfire took what it takes: maps, distance, answers, and left what it leaves: a voice you keep reaching for in static. Her routines were ballast. Morning. Fuel the stove, sweep the salt crust that sneaks through every seam, ascend the spiral, and clean the lens in slow circles, counterclockwise, always counterclockwise, the way the old keeper taught her. Check the lantern mantle, notes in the log, fog at 3 Kates, swell steady from the west, wind, NE 10-12 knots. Midday, walk the perimeter path with a coil of line and a small toolbox, tighten what's loosened, knot what's fraying, pick up the broken shells, gulls leave on the steps. Evening, test the foghorn, record an hour of coastline sound for a project no one has asked for, and only she will hear. On the second step down to the stones, just below the drip line, she placed a low crate she'd salvaged from the storage room. A wooden box with smooth edges, a corner cut away so there was no trap, only shelter. Inside, she laid an old square of sailcloth, thick and stiff, the smell of salt already fused into its threads. Beside the opening, the shallow bowl she'd used the night before. She warmed milk and a little fish broth, the steam a ghost against the morning. She set it down and backed away until the doorway framed her like a respectful portrait, present but not intruding. She did not speak, she did not reach. Wild things don't need our hands, they need our absence arranged kindly. The small shape under the step did not move at first. Wind tickled the cedar boughs and found a careful whistle in the lighthouse eaves. Ellie stood without fidgeting, hands tucked under her elbows for warmth and restraint. When the creature finally emerged, quieter in daylight, ribs still counting themselves under thin fur, it paused, as if reading the air for verbs she couldn't hear. Then it stepped to the dish and drank with tiny, efficient laps. A droplet clung to one whisker and trembled. She felt it in her throat. She logged without names, not a cat, she wrote in the margins of her mind. Bobcat, 8 to 10 weeks. Tufted ears, blue-grey eyes, right forepaw favor slight. Response, food accepted outdoors, no handling, no coaxing, no entry. She had worked with animals enough to know the rules that keep them animals. If there was a mother, distance would be the first language of trust. After the bowl lay empty and the cub retreated to the crate, Ellie walked the bluff path with her coil of line, eyes on the ground, the way trackers do. Rain had softened the sand to a forgiving page. There, at the seam where dune grass meets stone, she found what she had seen in a flicker last night and hadn't let herself believe. Larger prints, round and clean, the pads pressed with confidence, the hind slightly overstepping the fore. Cat, not dog. They traced a half-moon around the lighthouse and vanished down a deer trail toward the ravine. Her heart lifted and steadied in the same beat, not abandoned, not stolen by weather. Watched. She returned to the door and stood on the threshold again, that narrow country where worlds borrow each other's air. The lantern glass caught a pale smear of sun and threw it onto the floorboards. Below, the Pacific rehearsed its sentence on the stones. She turned the radio on, then off. The static was the same story either way. She smiled at the small crate, at the sailcloth edge stirred by the breeze, at the empty bowl catching the light. I will listen, she thought, a private vow without sound. And I will stay out of the way. In the log, she drew a short line she used to mark a weather change. It meant only this: be ready. Out past the kelp line, a cormorant arrowed close to the water, then rose, as if to say the day would have more to say back. She waited until the light shifted, grey loosening to a thinner grey, before she crouched at the step and truly looked. The little body under the overhang blinked once, slow, as if waking from a rain-dragged dream. Tufted ears, black bars faint at the forelegs. The muzzle too wide for a house cat, the eyes the blue-grey of the shelf see before the sun breaks it. When the forepaw lifted, Ellie saw the tiny hitch and catalogued it without pity. Information, not invitation. She warmed a shallow dish, milk eased with fish broth, neither rich nor scant, just enough. Steam fogged the kitchen window in a soft oval, a lens inside a lens. She carried the bowl to the threshold and set it near the crate she'd fixed from the storage room, a wooden frame with a corner cut away so there would be no trap, only roof and windbreak. The sailcloth inside smelled of salt and old rope. She'd folded it twice to make the surface thick but springy, like beach grass after rain. No words. No reaching. She backed into the doorway and let the wind do the talking. The cub came on its belly at first, ribs counting themselves, paws splayed, whiskers jeweled with mist. At the bowl, it paused, head up, nostrils flaring in small, mathematical arcs. Then the tongue, rapid, careful, efficient, found the edge. The sound, that small rhythmic tap, braided with the sea's breath and the lantern's cooling tick, until the porch was all metronomes and tide. Ellie let her lungs follow the slowest one and kept her hands anchored to her sleeves. Bobcat, she confirmed, in the quiet room where she kept her mind. 8 to 10 weeks, mild fever right for. Coat thin from wet, not disease. Eye film clear. Fear present, not panicked. She did not think rescue. She thought interval, a word that had saved her many times at sea. You hold a distance. You honor it. You listen for what crosses it. When the bowl lay empty and the cub nosed the rim for memory, Ellie slid the dish away with the toe of her boot and set a second, smaller measure on the stone, nearer the crate's mouth. The animal tracked the change, ears turning like compass needles, another sequence of sips. Then, without touching anything she had touched, it tucked itself inside the box and into the curve of sailcloth, as if finding the shape it had been missing. Its breath grew even. The wind found a whistle in the gallery railing and held it a long time, then let it go. Ellie cleaned the first bowl at the sink with water hot enough to veil the glass, then dried it with an old towel marked with a faded harbor name. She placed both bowls on the table, edge to edge, as if aligning constellations. From her coat pocket she drew the small radio, thumbed the dial a fraction, listened to the honest, faithful static, and turned it off again. Not tonight, she told the silence that lived in her. Tonight someone else was transmitting. She hung a recording mic beneath the porch beam, low-tech and weather-safe, pointed toward the bluff path where she'd seen the larger crescent's arc. No camera. The beam would carry what eyes fail. She made a note in the log, printing clean. 0937 cub fed outside. Shelter provided. No handling. Mic set for overnight. Possible adult nearby. Just before dusk, the fog returned with the confidence of a local. The crate darkened to a single square. The sailcloth became a pale cave. Ellie stood at the door and felt the threshold under her soles like a live wire. Somewhere below, the Pacific rehearsed an old argument with the rocks, losing beautifully. From the woods came a sound so soft she might have missed it if her life hadn't taught her to hear small things. A brief, rising trill, there and gone, like a match struck behind glass. The cub lifted its head. Ellie did not move. She turned the porch light one notch lower and let the dark have its work. Then she set the kettle, closed her hands around its warmth, and made the decision that would carry them both through the night. She would keep the bowls clean, the shelter dry, the distance true. She would not name what needed no name. She would listen. And if the wild answered, it would be because she'd left room for its voice. The first clear day came like a warranty card slipped under the door. Unexpected, official, not to be argued with. After a week of pewter skies, the light turned thin and hard, revealing edges she'd forgotten had edges. Cedar needles burned clean, basalt shoulders slick as sealbacks, gulls stenciled sharply against a brass coin of sun. Ellie stood on the gallery and felt the building warm under her palms. Below, the Pacific breathed without complaint. On the step, the shallow bowl steamed like a small vow. After the cub drank, Efficient, unshowy, Ellie washed the dish till it squeaked and set it on the table inside, edge to edge with its twin. She lifted the crate, not with hands but with care, sliding it along the boards the length of a boot. Not a relocation, an invitation to read the page a little wider. The wooden box stopped where shadow gave way to a wash of open light, still under the roofline, still a partial cave, now facing the bluff's deer path instead of the stairwell. Echo, she never said the name aloud, stood in the opening, considering. Tufted ears worked through possibilities. The cub stepped out, then back in as if testing the floor for grammar. When the wind brought the forest's breath, a cool green seam that had nothing of the sea in it, the little body leaned toward it like a question. Ellie's own body learned its role, still life. She stood in the doorway with her hands fixed under her elbows and the recorder slung low under the porch beam, its red diode a pinprick of intention. The radio stayed in her coat pocket, faithful as always, and silent by command. Sound would be taken, not asked for. She had come to believe that was a kind of courtesy. By midday, the mud along the deer path had softened to clay, and clay, obliging as paper, wrote what passed. Ellie found the script after lunch, a necklace of paw prints laid in a patient arc around the lighthouse, pads round and clean, claws sheathed, the hind foot stepping neatly into the four's old news. Not dog, not coyote, cat. The stride was measured, never rushing, only once broken by a tight cluster near the bluff where the view opened like a throat. There, the marks overlapped as if the body had paused, sat, considered, then risen again, an auditor, not a trespasser. She followed the track until it disappeared into Broome and Salal, the green crowd swallowing story with good manners. At a bend in the path, a single hair caught on a splinter of driftwood winked in the sun, light as spider silk, banded warm. She did not touch it. She touched instead the thought that arrived as easily as breathing. Watched and more than watched. The watching had a grammar. It made room. That night the recorder brought back its weather, wind's vowel, rain's percussive consonants, and then a curve that never belonged to water. A soft, rising trill, brief as a lifted match. The spectrogram drew it like a boat wake in moonlight, thin, then widening, then gone. 2 minutes later came a smaller answer, timid at the start, sure by the end. Ellie closed her eyes because seeing now felt like the rudest sense. The exchange carried no panic. It carried a lesson. Beyond the porch, the mother was holding school. On the next clear day, she moved the crate another boot length toward the tree line, never crossing past the last step, never hiding the box, never closing the gap that made the house feel like a promise. She shifted the bowls too, small rotations, never predictable, teaching hunger to hunt for smell and sound, not paint and plank. The sailcloth held its weathered crease like an old chart. Echo absorbed these edits with the gravity of a student who suspects the test is already in session. The cub learned to sit with its back to the human world, reading the slot of trees like a future. When a breeze carried cedar and rain shadow, its whiskers annotated the air. It practiced patience with rope and driftwood until patience turned to motion and back to stillness again. It chirped, rarely. A needle of sound that stitched and tied off in a single heartbeat. When it came, the cub's head swung toward the deer path, as if every syllable should be held up against that tree line to see if it fit. Ellie's own discipline tightened. She stopped stepping onto the boards at night, switching to wool socks so her body could become less noun, more weather. She angled her face away. A direct stare can feel like a hand. She waited longer between bowls. She pulled the dish early by a mouthful and lived with the ache that rose in her throat when the little tongue searched the dry rim from habit. The ache had a purpose. Purpose is the only pain she trusts. By late week, the fog that had been sleeping off shift returned at dusk, a soft militia that took every corner and kept the porch light in a zen circle on the boards. She tuned the recorder for low gain, adjusted the windscreen with the same gentleness she once used on deck winches. A gull's heckle clipped the microphone and passed. Farther out, harbour seals worked the kelp line with amateur solemnity. Nearer, broom pods snapped their small fingers as they dried. In that mix, the mother's voice threaded like a violin under a street parade, softer, older, undeniable. Ellie felt her ribcage answer it. Some frequencies become architecture. At 02:11 a.m. the file showed a different architecture entirely. The sound of paws on wet plank, a hollowed rhythm she'd learned in the first week, a light quadrupedal tap with enough conviction to claim space without asking. The mother had stepped onto the lowest stair. No growl, no hiss. A pause. Then the trill. A beat later, the cub's reply underneath, thinner, higher, a sketch of the same curve. Then a long quiet that wasn't absence, it was attention. Ellie did not move in her bed. The recorder would tell her what happened more honestly than eyes through glass. She received the silence as if it were content. When the file ended, the sea went on speaking, and she slept the way weather sleeps, interrupted, faithful. Come morning, she didn't check the footage first. She took the bowls to the tap and ran water until it steamed, the kitchen window fogging to a country of milk. She set a small measure of broth on the step and stepped back into the doorway, arms folded, breath slow. Echo emerged at a measured pace, drank, and sat looking out, not back. The crate's mouth faced the path. The woods hung a curtain of shade. In that shade, the space where Prince ought to be became sufficient proof. A mother who knew how to teach without leaving a headline. Ellie walked the perimeter at noon, coil of line over her shoulder, the lighthouse ticking softly in the sun. At the north bend, she found the tracks again, clearer now, written in last night's flattened grass. They curved around the building in an elegant crescent, widened near the path to stand, tightened near the gallery to listen, then unfurled back into the green. It read like a kindness. It read like control. She felt a cool thread pull through her chest and anchor somewhere clean. Maybe the forest is testing my silence, she thought, not as a warning, but as an assignment. That evening, she pushed the crate one last boot length toward the edge of the porch, the nearest it would ever come to the woods without leaving human architecture. The box still held 2 exits and no door. She tied nothing. She promised nothing. She aligned the bowls with the wind and set the porch light to a thin coin again. The red diode of the recorder kept its small heart. Just before the dark learned to be fully dark, a shape appeared at the edge of the deer path. No drama, just density. The mother. Muscles written in a fluent script under damp fur, left for favoring by a letter, eyes bright as wet basalt. She did not enter the porch. She didn't have to. She sat. The cub stood inside the crate, then on the threshold, then a step out. Their bodies made a grammar no hand could improve. Ellie held her place like a word that knows its job. The exchange came, a trill, an answer, a silence that gathered them both like arms, then the softest scrape of claws on bark as the larger body turned and moved back into the green. Echo stayed planted a beat, as if adding the last column in a sum, then flowed after, not running, not sneaking, belonging. The crate sat open, the bowls sat clean, the lighthouse exhaled, the sea kept time. In her log, Ellie drew the slender arc she used for weather changes. It meant what it had always meant, hold your line, the rest would come. The weather loosened its fist and opened into a cool, lucid afternoon, the kind that writes everything sharper. Ellie used the clarity to check her perimeters. Along the deer path, just where the trail pinched between Salal and the bluff's drop, Clay held a clean paragraph of prints, round pads, claws sheathed, the hind stepping neatly into the fore's memory, not dog, not coyote. Cat, full-grown, deliberate. The stride curved in a neat parenthesis around the lighthouse, widened at the overlook where the sea unrolled, then narrowed again into the dark green. At one turn, the impressions overlapped, a tidy cluster as if the animal had paused and listened. An auditor, not a trespasser. She didn't touch the track. She stepped back and let the evidence breathe. A single hair, banded warm, shimmered on a splinter of driftwood and lifted in the wind like a promise. Watched, she thought. And more than watched. The watching had grammar. It made room. Back at the porch, she slid the crate a boot length toward the tree line. No drama, no scrape, just the quiet of wood over old boards. 2 exits stayed open, roofed, not closed. The opening faced the path now so the little animal could read its own future straight ahead. The bowls rotated with their dull discipline, never the same board twice, never an approach that turned habit into leash. Distance arranged kindly. Echo, she never said the name aloud, stepped out of the crate, then back in, testing the light as if it were temperature. After the bowl emptied, he sat with his back to the house and his attention pinned to the seam of cedar beyond the steps. He didn't look for her. He looked into sentences the woods had not yet said out loud. When wind combed the needles, his ears answered like compass hands. When wind stopped, so did he. Learning has that posture when it's honest. Ellie matched him. Fewer feedings, smaller measures. Bowls removed before the rim grew interesting. In the log she drew the slender arc she'd used at sea when weather changed. Hold your line. Then she drew it again, because repetition was its own ballast. After dusk she wore wool socks on the boards, so her presence sounded like weather. She angled her face away from the crate. A direct gaze can feel like a verb. Nouns only. Structure without claim. She left the camera in its drawer. Sound would be witness. Eyes want theatre, ears take testimony. Beneath the porch beam, the recorder's red diode kept its small heart. Midnight thickened. A gull's broken hinge of a cry skated the wind and died. The foghorn cleared its throat somewhere offshore and reconsidered. Rain arrived in a soft handwriting that didn't cross its T's. Under it all, the sea kept time, the old argument with stone, losing beautifully. At 02:09 a.m. paws touched wet plank, hollow, quadrupedal, unhurried. The waveform lifted on her laptop like breath, a pause. Then the mother's voice, soft, rising, brief. A trill a human throat can't make, shaped like a boat wake in moonlight. 2 minutes later, a thinner line stitched beneath it. The cub's reply, pitched higher, less certain, trying the note on for fit. No panic lived there, only a lesson. Beyond the threshold, a mother was holding school. Dawn wrote no headline. Proof sat quiet as a bowl. Fresh prints feathered the step and turned away again, respectful of borders. Echo drank, then arranged himself in the posture of listening, small body stacked over patient paws, whiskers annotating air. He chirped once, a pinprick of sound, and held his ground. The crate was a dock now, nothing more. The lesson lived elsewhere. By noon, she followed the arc again around the building, the coil of lines slung at her shoulder by old habit. Tracks in better handwriting appeared at the north bend, wide steps, then a tidy cluster where a head might have turned. Near the gallery ladder, an oval pressed deep where weight held to listen. At the ravine mouth, prints darkened, then rose to stone and vanished into broom with exemplary manners. Control wrote those lines. Courtesy did too. Her adjustments kept pace. She shifted the crate another boot length, its final one, toward the edge of the porch, and stopped. Here the house ended and the woods began. To cross would be to lie about allegiance. She would not. The box kept its 2 exits. The sailcloth held the memory of bodies without asking for ownership. She set the porch light to a thin coin and stepped back into the doorway, present but absent, the way a lighthouse is present to ships, available, not involved. Fog rebuilt itself toward evening, climbing the bluff and drawing chalk lines around every sound. The porch shrank to a square of pale. The recorder asked for a lower gain. She obliged. Inside, the radio in her coat pocket kept its faithful hush. She did not turn the dial. When the wild speaks, you don't ask it to speak louder. You make your own room quieter. Dark arrived fully itself. The deer path gathered a certainty that preceded shape, the way thunder promises itself before it's a sound. The mother stood where railing shadow broke, wintered fur wet with mist, left for favoring by a letter. She didn't enter, she didn't need to. She sat. Echo rose inside the crate. Then to the threshold, then a step onto the plank. Their bodies made a grammar no hand could improve. The trill came, curved and clean. The answer followed, thinner but brave. Silence gathered around them like arms, not empty, not stalled, simply attention welded shut. When the larger body turned, it moved as if obeying a law already written in the slope and the salal. Echo waited a breath, counted to one the way small things do, and followed, not sneaking, not rushing, belonging. Ellie held the doorway like a respectful border. She didn't move, she didn't speak. The bowls stayed bowls, the crate stayed open. The lighthouse breathed. In the log, she drew the slender arc one more time and wrote beneath it, small and even, hold your line. She underlined once, then set down the pencil and listened to the house, to the wind, to the new quiet the night had earned. The wild was answering. Her only work now was to keep the room ready. The storm arrived the way big things do on this coast, first as a rumor in the cedar tops, then as a pressure in the glass, then as rain marching sideways with its shoulders hunched. The lighthouse tightened along its iron spine. Ellie banked the stove, set the lantern low, and checked the recorder beneath the porch beam one last time. The red diode answered like a small, steady heart. She thumbed the radio in her coat pocket out of habit and left it off. When the wild wants to speak, you don't shout over it. You make yourself quieter. Wind shouldered the door. Spray came up from the rocks like breath. The porch light, turned to a thin coin, kept a soft circle of scents on the boards. Inside the crate, Echo slept in a curve of sailcloth, belly lifting, falling, lifting again, calm as a tide pool before the breaker finds it. Then the breaker found it. A dull thump sounded below the steps, not loud, solid, the kind of sound weight makes when it declares itself without apology. Ellie stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust to the bruise-colored night. At first, the storm had more edges than anything living. Then a cut in the dark assembled itself into muscle and rain. The mother stood where railing shadow broke, winter in her coat, left fore-favoring by a letter, eyes level as wet stone. She didn't enter. She didn't need to. She lowered herself to the plank with care, not crouching as a hunter, but settling as a presence. The rain sewed a glitter into her whiskers. Wind carried the cedars cold. The sea sang its old argument with the bluff and lost beautifully. Echo woke. He sat, still as a buoy in heavy chop. The two faced one another across a gap, small enough to stop the heart, and large enough to keep it beating. Ellie held the doorway, a respectful border. Every part of her wanted to move, forward, back, anywhere, but the only motion she allowed was breath. The trill came, curved and clean. It reached the recorder as a bright seam on a field of grey. It reached the porch as a sound you don't hear so much as accept. Echo answered with a thinner arc, trying on the note for fit. His ears flicked, then steadied. The mother pressed her nose to the crate's open corner and breathed the sailcloth, the wood, the small breath inside. No growl, no hiss. The storm did all the noise-making, the cats did the meaning. Ellie's fingers found the crate door that wasn't a door, the corner she'd cut, so there would never be a trap, only shelter. She crouched slowly, palms open, eyes lowered. Everything she had learned about distance gathered itself into one simple act, permission. "Go," she said, but only inside the mouth that thought for her. The word she let the porch have was none at all. She touched the wooden edge and lifted it a finger's width, then another, until the opening made its own sense. Echo stood, a small line of rain on his whiskers, trembling like wire. He placed one paw on the plank, then the other, weight as careful as a question. The mother didn't move, she only existed more. Ellie kept to her rule, offer nothing you can't keep. She made herself background, house, weather, lighthouse breathing. She felt the old ache rise, hands wanting to prove themselves kind, and let it pass like a wave. Mercy, misapplied, is only another leash. Echo stepped fully out. He turned once, not to plead and not to bless, but to understand the geometry of the room he was leaving. His body aligned with the mother's body the way compass needles find north, not quickly, not slowly, but with conviction. The gap closed without a sound. For a long beat, nothing changed. Air in, air out, rain carving lines in the light. Then the mother rose and turned toward the deer path. The gesture was spare as a law, this way. Echo followed, not sneaking and not rushing, belonging. The path received them and closed behind them with the politeness of Salal. Ellie stayed in the doorway until the storm made them legend. She didn't call, she didn't cry. She pressed her palm to the doorframe, feeling the building's old bones answer hers. On the recorder, a final pair of notes stitched the field. One low, one lighter, both complete. And then the sea took back the page. She lowered herself to the step and sat a while with the empty crate, the clean bowls, the thin coin of light. The radio in her pocket was a quiet weight. She thought, not with triumph, not with loss, but with a clarity that felt borrowed. The wild hears more than we ever say. When she finally rose, she left the porch as she had found it, open. The lighthouse breathed. The storm moved on to rewrite other cliffs. In the log, she drew the slender arc she used for weather turning and wrote 3 words beneath it, small and even, interval kept, permission given. Dawn came thin and honest. The kind of light that doesn't argue with what it finds. The storm had wrung the world clean. Every cedar needle wore a bead. Every board was the color of wet coins. Ellie opened the door and let the cold slip around her like a careful hand. The crate sat where she'd left it, roofed, open, ordinary again. The bowls were stacked and dry from the night before, 2 quiet moons on the table by the window. She stepped onto the porch and saw what the light wanted her to see. On the top stair, a single oval of water where a paw had stood and then not stood. Beyond, a scatter of droplets marked a small body shaking itself free of rain before choosing direction. On the path itself, clay held the sentence cleanly, 2 lines of prints, paired but not touching, one wide, confident, one smaller, quick, curving toward the deer trail and the darker green beyond. The sea lifted and set its chest against the rocks, calmer now, like someone catching breath after a run. Ellie didn't follow. She stood at the threshold and read the page until it faded into Salal. 2 sets, side by side, a morning after that required no witness and had one anyway. Her mouth formed a thank you she didn't spend out loud. Inside, she washed the bowls, set them edge to edge where they lived, and wiped the porch rail with the corner of a towel that still smelled faintly of harbor rope and vinegar. All day the lighthouse rehearsed its simple tasks: fuel, lens, log, perimeter. In the files from the night, the waveform told the rest with the candor she trusted. Wind's broad vowel, rain's quick percussion, then a pair of notes at 0231 that matched the ones at the door. One low, one lighter, like a signature written twice to be sure the paper remembers. After that, nothing but the sea. She labeled the take the way a careful hand writes on old jars: turn, night of, exit true. 3 days passed before they returned, or perhaps she learned to be still enough to let the world admit them. Late afternoon, when the sun went amber and the bluff cast a longer rib of shadow, something changed in the air's attention. Ellie put down the grease pencil and turned without turning. At the edge where the deer trail begins to think about being a road, the brush parted by a syllable. The mother stepped out first, rain gloss gone now, fur brushed to a clean script, the faint favor at her left fore, reading as history instead of harm. Echo came beside her. longer in the leg, edges sharpened by use. They did not advance. They did not retreat. They stood with the set of creatures who have decided something already and are waiting only for time to catch up. The mother looked once at the crate, then at Ellie. Not a challenge, not a bow, just a calibration, like checking the wind before a line is thrown. A low trill braided the quiet. Echo answered with a note that had learned its own weight. Then both turned and folded back into the green with the same courtesy they had brought to her door. Goodbye, she thought. Not because you must, because you can. That evening, when the light went soft as the inside of a shell, Ellie took the sailcloth from the crate and shook the salt from its seams. She folded it twice, then once more, until it fit her hands. The crate she left where it was, a spare roof for whatever needed weather less. On the recorder, she set a longer take, not to catch them again, but to keep faith with the room that had made their voices possible. She wrote in the log, 2 sets at dawn, return at dusk, observed intact, border held, and beneath it, the slender arc she used for weather turning, underlined once. She set the porch light to its thinnest coin and stood there until the horizon made its quiet promise and kept it. The house breathed. The sea kept time. Somewhere in the trees, a limb cracked under its own wet. When she finally closed the door, the room felt larger, not for what it contained, but for what it had allowed to pass through unbroken. The wild hears more than we ever say, she thought. And when it answers, the right thing is to make space and remember. She didn't mail a letter. She recorded one. When the house had shed its heat, Ellie set a mic and named the file, The Wild Hears You. Her voice was lower than she remembered, shaped by salt and time. She spoke to no one and to everyone who might open a door someday. She told the story slant, how a bowl can be mercy and boundary, how shelter must never become a net, how silence can be the kindest tool when the wild is trying to speak. She ended the take and didn't play it back. Instead, she slid the card beside the small radio she still carried, the one that had taught her what absence weighs. 2 voices on one shelf, a hush that kept its promise, and a proof that the world still answered. Days thinned into a gentler routine. She rinsed the bowls and shelved them, left the crate as a roof for rain-shy swallows, and carried an envelope of sea daisy seed to the bluff. The dirt there is stingy, but it agrees to generosity if asked kindly. She pressed color into it with her thumb, a scatter big enough to be found and wild enough to refuse straight lines. An uncarved stone named the place in her head, Echo's Field. The ranger's parcel arrived when the fog smelled like metal. No letter, just a padded sleeve and coordinates in a tidy hand. Inside, a thumb drive rattled. She plugged it in and watched the waveform unfurl. Wind, surf, a gull working out a grievance. And there, thin but right, the braid she knew by heart. 2 trills close together, one lower, one lighter. Farther north, farther home. Ellie leaned back and let the chair's old wood keep her. The room held 2 artifacts in easy peace. The radio, that would never speak again, and the recording that never had to. Not victory, not repair, continuity. The wild had not closed its door. It had simply resumed its business with her name, penciled briefly in the margin. She wrote 1 line in the log and underlined it once. Evidence sufficient. Border held. Then she went outside and watched wind lay its palm on the grass until the blades shone like fresh tin. When visitors came, and sometimes they did, neighbors stitched thinly along the coast, she didn't give them a story about taming or belonging. She poured tea and said, "Leave food to the professionals, leave space to the animals. If the wild remembers you, remember it back by staying kind and staying out." They nodded the way people do when a rule fits the size of their life. At dusk, she set the porch light to a thin coin and listened. The house breathed, the sea kept time, and from the tree line came only what should: wind, small birds, no footsteps. She touched the radio once and let it be. The wild hears more than we ever say, she whispered, not asking for an answer, only making room for one tonight. The night settled soft as smoke along the bluff. Down the slope, the sea unrolled its endless breath, patient and sure. Ellie stood by the open door, a cup cooling in her hands, and watched the porch light cast its pale circle on the empty boards. Beyond that circle, the forest held its quiet pulse, unchanged and forgiving. She smiled, not at what had come, but at what had gone right. This is Paw Prints and Stories. Stay gentle. The wild remembers. Disclaimer. This story is for inspiration and education. Do not interact with wildlife without professional guidance and local authorization.